Hi, my name is George Reese. I actually tend to wear two hats when it comes to events like this. First is I'm an author on cloud computing for O'Reilly Cloud Application Architectures, written some other books as well, most recently a book called REST API Design Handbook. So I've got this sort of neutral role that I play in talking about cloud computing in particular as larger entities adopted at scale. But I'm also CTO of a vendor of cloud services, a company called Instratus, who does cloud infrastructure management aimed primarily at enterprises and the needs of enterprise customers. So in this presentation, those worlds sort of come together, and I'm going to talk about how you go about as an enterprise tackling the problem of making cloud computing a strategic part of how you build out IT infrastructure. And before I jump too far into this discussion, I want to lay a little lattice on which this discussion will get built. And my background isn't initially in technology. I actually, my undergraduate degree's in philosophy. I got out of college and I went and worked in Hollywood for a while. And so, I went into Hollywood doing, video editing on very expensive technology. Over time, when I finally got into technology, one of the first things I did is I spent all the money I earned in building out my own edit bay and stuff like that. And of course today, you have in the hands of any desktop user or laptop user or even an iPad user, the ability to make high-definition television quality productions that are greater in quality than what I could do when I was working in Hollywood in the early 90s. And technology is all about that ultimately. It's an innovation. It's empowering the individual to do things that could only be done at an organizational level. And as we talk about enterprise cloud adoption, it's important to keep that metaphor in mind because one of the interesting things about cloud computing is that it is an instance in which an innovation has empowered an individual within an organization to do things that the organization had entire departments for. And that, of course, creates some interesting opportunities and some interesting risks. So, as businesses go into, adopting cloud computing, it's not about going really into adopting cloud computing. It's more of this four-stage process that starts with people just playing around, the experimentation phase. And generally that's, somebody in a business unit just has an idea and they found out about, in 2008, 2009, they just learned about Amazon, and so they decided to use it to do that. Now it's a little bit more prior awareness of Amazon and other cloud computing options, and they go try things out, and and it works, it doesn't work, and it plays into some sort of greater picture. At that point, one of two things happens. They decide, generally they always decide it's a really cool thing and we need to mainstream it. But either they decide on their own that the IT department or whoever the powers that be are that govern how stuff get deployed into production in an organization, they decide that they're going to be hostile, and so they go behind their back without telling them. Or IT gets involved and starts trying to implement process on it, and so ultimately these guys go rogue. And you hear, the term shadow IT, rogue IT. I'm calling it going rogue here, but essentially you got people who are now not just experimenting, but they're deploying real things that are used by the business, potentially in front of customers, that IT has no visibility in for whatever reason. The third stage is when IT decides to clamp down on this, and they say, oh my God, we've got all these people, doing stuff in the cloud, and we've got to control this. And so IT ends up often doing things that run counter to the value proposition of cloud and encouraging further going rogue of the organization. Ultimately, the scramble for order never results in order. It results in further rogueness. And the final one is enterprise adoption, where there's acceptance of cloud as part of an enterprise IT. And how do we roll that out strategically so that the business units don't want to go rogue? They like the role that IT is playing in terms of guaranteeing or as the overseer of governance and risk management, while at the same time being able to do exactly what they want to do. And hopefully in this presentation, you can never skip stage one. Stage one is really critical to you understanding why you want to do cloud in the first place. But hopefully I can help a little bit in you skipping stage 2 and 3, or at least getting out of them quickly if you're in one of those. So if you're on the IT side of things, it's really important to understand the rogues. They're not trying to break the rules. They're not trying to do damage to the business, and they may or may not appreciate the risks that you appreciate, but what they are trying to do is get stuff done, ultimately. That's really the only thing they want to do. They got a job to do. They may have some cool ideas they need to try out, and they just want to get them done. And if they have to go through a 6-month procurement process to try out these ideas and do these things, that doesn't help them do their job and makes their job miserable. So they're trying to get around the barriers that exist out there, created by, things like idle and things like just general bureaucratic inertia of organizations. What they're ultimately doing is they're getting agility out of the cloud and the ability to do things that are within their budget quickly and move on with life. Now, there is a real downside to it. You can't have a business in which people are just simply allowed to go rogue, because ultimately that will bite you. It puts the company at risk from a governance perspective. In other words, we've got customers who have come to us and they have like 100 AWS accounts. They know, let me put it this way, IT knows they have more or less 100 or so AWS accounts, but they really have zero visibility into them, and they don't actually know who has those accounts. They just know they get occasionally these expense reports with credit card charges that are going out to AWS. So this lack of visibility can do a lot of things. Like, let's say you sell off a business unit to somebody else. How do you account for those systems that you're unaware of? How do you guarantee to a third-party entity that you're compliant, and that actually goes into the next point, compliance, with whatever they need you to be compliant with. And compliance goes beyond just, a simple whatever the third party's asking you. It's, government regulations, industry certifications, all that stuff. If you need to adhere to any kind of compliance, and you got people going rogue, you cannot guarantee to the powers that be that care about that stuff that you're compliant. Finally is risk management. If you've got somebody putting up a system in any cloud and they don't understand the principles of design for failure and fault tolerance application architectures, they could be putting out something that's critical to the business, and what's worse is a lot of times people don't realize it's critical to the business until there's a failure and suddenly there's a larger business issue that crops up. This going rogue brings up these kind of risk management issues. So the enterprise approach to cloud computing, defining an enterprise cloud strategy starts with preserving and enhancing the value proposition of cloud computing. And I'm going to come back to that point time and time again. And going back to the Hollywood analogy, there is no putting the genie back in the bottle. There is no stopping grandma from making home movies that are reasonable quality. There is no, if you put barriers in people's way, they will go around those barriers if the technology allows them to. And I've seen it time and time again where people have put in complex IT workflows to, gate certain things. The business always finds a way to get around those things if the technology enables them. So you have to preserve the value proposition of cloud. The next phrase, it's a phrase that I got from a person named Chris Hoff, to give him fair credit, graceful loss of control. That's really what IT's role in a strategy is to do. It is to gracefully lose control over the infrastructure in a way that preserves their control over the things that matter while relinquishing controls of the things that don't. And ultimately, in a big picture sense, what happens is it means moving control from procurement time activities to operational activities once things are going. And I'll talk more about exactly what that means. And then finally, minimize its risk. You're not going to eliminate risk no matter what you do. You won't eliminate risk staying where you are. And anytime you introduce change, you're introducing new risk. And obviously, cloud computing represents unknowns for any organization as they internalize it. So if the first part is preserving the value proposition, you have to understand what that value proposition is. Why did the business go into the cloud? And the first is this on-demand nature of the cloud. The idea of being able to get access to resources when you need it, not sitting around and waiting for some approval process or somebody else to take care of it for you. You have a need, you scratch it now. That is one of the most basic principles of cloud computing. Second bit is metered, and we get away from discussions of this metered aspect a little bit lately since we're not in the middle of a financial crisis. In 2008, 2009, the metered aspect of cloud computing was really huge. But the difference between CapEx and OpEx matters, and the ability to pay for exactly what you're using rather than having to come up front, estimate demand, all that stuff, it really does matter. And especially when you get down to the business units who have a much harder time justifying capital expenditures than they do justifying operational expenditures. And then finally is a phrase that tends to drive people nuts a bit, the perception of infinite capacity. Obviously, not even Amazon has infinite capacity, but the perception of infinite capacity is essentially the idea that when I request a resource, I feel pretty darn near certain I am going to get that resource, and really, really, really confident about that, such that over time it feels like it really is infinite capacity. To me, the most important thing about cloud computing, above you put all these things together, and what it really does for an organization is allow fail fast and fail often. And people get focused on the idea of failure, and the reason failure in an IT context is such a bad idea is that without cloud computing, failure is a really expensive thing. It's a career-limiting move for most IT projects. So people are not comfortable with the idea of IT and failure, even though most IT projects fail. Now, what cloud computing lets you do is obviously go spin up machines, try out an idea, find out that it was a really dumb idea, and move on with your life, and nobody sees anything other than $15 on an expense report. There are obviously more grandiose versions of that, like failure to plan for capacity and so on. Bottom line is the ability to fail is really critical to the ability to innovate and compete. This cloud computing came about, and why I want to get into this just very shortly, is that people think that, okay, I'm going to go build my own cloud, and it really isn't that simple. Cloud computing isn't a technology thing. All of the technologies that made up cloud actually are very old technologies. Some of the newest ones date back to like 2000. That's, you know, so at least a decade old, and in many cases, many decades old. What is different is that a couple of companies, and in particular one company, Amazon, has achieved economies of scale that just don't exist at other organizations, period. And more important than that, they're able to turn around and export those economies of scale to you for you to take advantage of them in a more efficient way than you could possibly do on your own. And that's an important thing, because if you were going to try and replicate that experience internally, you're going to have a very hard time matching the economies of scale that Amazon has achieved. What makes it easy for the business units, the developers, and why it's important to understand that you know, no matter how hard you try to control cloud, if you become a barrier to the value proposition, this easy stuff is going to make it easy for them to get around. And namely, if they have a need and they got a credit card, they can consume any cloud computing services. With or without whatever you might be doing from a central IT perspective. And you don't need to really know that much. Going back to the video editing analogy, it used to be that, you know, people like me got paid, well, at the time it was like $15 an hour, but that was a lot of money back in the early 90s for an hourly job. But, you know, from, you know, a specialist in video editing to today, anybody with an iPad or a laptop or whatever can edit. And we are getting to the point where anybody can run a server, anybody can deploy an app. Now, it's not quite the same, because you still need developer skills and that sort of stuff. And the reality about living with this is you actually do need a lot more technical knowledge than is apparent. And that's the danger of cloud computing, is it isn't required for the initial use of the service, but it is required for living with the service. And then, of course, the immediate gratification bit. They launch a VM, do whatever it is they were trying to do, and they can see the result right away. What makes it so hard, and I've already sort of alluded to this about the complexity, the mismatch between the technical knowledge needed to get started versus living with it, but the bigger thing is that when you're talking about enterprise cloud adoption, there is no one solution fits all answer. You don't just buy, Amazon might not like me saying this, you don't just buy Amazon and have an enterprise cloud solution in place. You need other components to support that. You may need on-premise components to that, and tools that manage that, configuration management, cloud management. You probably need that all to talk to your systems management, your existing enterprise systems management. So you need to understand what all of these different things are. And even worse, you're probably, to effectively use cloud, you're probably introducing concepts that are foreign to an enterprise operations environment. NoSQL, DevOps, continuous integration. And you know, the thing about private clouds is they're really hard to operate well. It's not, people talk about the term cloud in a box. There is no cloud in a box. There's a reason Amazon has been so successful at what they're doing, is that it's really hard, and they figured it out, and they do it well, and it's hard for other people to replicate that. The other thing is that, as I mentioned earlier, you cannot have an enterprise where everybody's going rogue, because it will put the company at risk, and at one point it will cost real dollars. So IT does need to be involved there to help mitigate that risk. So the pieces that make up a cloud computing strategy start with, I know this audience is largely developers, so please excuse the use of the V word up here and in the next couple of slides. I'm going to talk about a vision statement. It's not this fuzzy, let's all go to an offsite for 2 weeks and figure things out. It's more of just understanding why the hell you're doing cloud computing in the first place. It is a very common mistake for companies to realize they're behind the ball on cloud computing and just say, oh my God, we need to go cloud, and not understand why it is they're doing that. The second piece is understanding the different service models behind cloud computing. And in the next slide, I'm going to talk in more detail about that. But infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and SaaS are not nice little buckets you stick things into, and you can't just say, okay, well, we're going to just be a pass shop and everything will be hunky-dory. It's a lot more complex than that. Then finally, when you're talking about big enterprises, every big enterprise has public and private components for the foreseeable future. I do think, I do buy into the Amazon vision that over time the private components will wither and perhaps die, but for the 20-teens, an enterprise cloud strategy does involve private, and you need to understand the relationship between the two. And then finally, you need to understand the cloud computing stack, or the wider ecosystem of things that make it so that you can manage a cloud infrastructure at scale. So, I said this a number of times, and I put it on a slide by itself because it's so important. You must understand the value proposition of cloud computing, why you're doing it, so that you can preserve the benefits of cloud computing, because that is the cardinal rule. Do no harm to the value that your business units are seeing, or they will go around you. So before defining the cloud strategy, it goes back to you can't skip the first stage. You have to experiment with the cloud. You need to have not simply provisioned some VMs in AWS. You need to actually, do something like test deploying a real, maybe something as simple as a lamp stack, or even, a more cool example would be to take like a Cloud Foundry environment and deploy it in a multi-node configuration and watch the thing auto-scale. Do some real meaningful experimentation with the cloud to understand why cloud computing and why Amazon's view of cloud computing in particular is so cool, but you need to understand the limitations of it. It's not all duckies and bunnies, and it's not the FUD that other people try to spread. It would be good to have some platform as a service experience, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about what I mean by that. It doesn't mean necessarily going out to Google App Engine or something like that and playing with their idea, because I don't think Google App Engine is very appropriate to enterprise. It's a more nuanced view of platform as a service. The last point, I'm going to skip straight to that, is no unicorns, no FUD. Don't get caught up into cloud's going to solve all your problems, and don't buy into the, oh, you can't have a secure, we just saw from NASDAQ today, you can have a secure operation inside the Amazon cloud. It's not, is the cloud secure, but do you have the tools to secure it for your needs? Because you can get the tools to secure it for your needs, so don't get caught up in the FUD. Want to spend just 1 second on the cloud vision, because the purpose of cloud vision, again, is not to come up with, stupid vision statement. It is to make sure everybody's agreeing why you're doing this in the first place. That's all it is. And generally, it's to make sure you understand the value proposition of cloud computing. Once you don't have to have the verbiage perfected or anything like that. Just, we want to make sure, preserve the agility of business units or whatever, suits your particular situation. And ultimately, when you're realizing this enterprise strategy, you need to make sure that whatever you're doing aligns with that. So this is the slide I've been alluding to about, comparing the different service elements. A couple of mistakes people get into. One is thinking that, okay, this is PaaS, this is SaaS, this is infrastructure, and that isn't the case at all. It's a continuum. Things are a little bit PaaS-y or a lot PaaS-y or a little bit SaaS-y or a lot SaaS-y. If you look at even Amazon, Amazon is not infrastructure as a service. It's not platform as a service. It's a bunch of services, some of which are very hardcore infrastructure as a service, and others which really are kind of, platform as a service. Not platform as a service in the same way that, Google would define it. For example, RDS, I consider a platform as a service option. It's not platform in the sense that you deploy a Java app and you don't care about the infrastructure, but you are deploying a schema and a database and you're not caring about the infrastructure. The other thing is don't believe the PaaS hype, and I don't mean that as negative as that necessarily comes off. PaaS, and really the thing you should be getting out of this part of the talk is that a mature enterprise has infrastructure, platform, and SaaS all together as part of what it's trying to do as cloud. And the reason I say don't believe the PaaS hype is there are a lot of PaaS proponents right now who see PaaS as the end of cloud computing, that we're all migrating eventually to this world in which everything is PaaS, and that just simply isn't true. And that's because if you go back to this slide here, what this continuum represents is a continuum from bespoke to commoditized. So over on the left, you have things that are totally custom, totally bespoke, that need more control and more tinkering with to realize your solution. Whereas over on the right with SaaS, you have things that are well understood problems and therefore somebody else has solved them in a way that you can consume. And the continuum in between, marches from the bespoke to the commoditized. And problems will always fit at points. There will always be new problems for which there is no commoditized solution. And eventually, those will migrate over to the commoditized portion, but new ones will pop up for the right-hand side. So there will always be a need for all three types of solutions. And I don't mean anybody to actually read this slide. As a matter of fact, I'm going to spend the least amount of time here on this particular wordy thing. The important thing is to understand the value proposition of the SaaS is around the idea of commoditized stuff. It is, people in the PaaS world like to hype up how PaaS is the end-all. Really, SaaS is the end-all of cloud computing. It represents the total commoditization of everything from the infrastructure stack all the way up to the actual business problem being solved. But the reality is that you can't have a commoditized solution for a new problem that's never existed before. So you can't have SaaS solve every single problem. So that's why we jumped down to PaaS. PaaS allows us to rapidly solve problems using known technology stacks without having to worry about the underlying infrastructure. So it allows you some flexibility at the business logic layer without having to deal with any need for bespoke infrastructure. But infrastructure as a service gives you the widest control over all the factors that operate most problems. But even infrastructure as a service won't always be the end-all be-all, because the thing that I left off even further to the left of infrastructure is your virtualized data centers and your bare metal. There will always be problems that need custom hardware that's specific to the problem domain in question. Probably not the number of problems is going to shrink eventually, but there probably will always exist. Again, another wordy slide I'm not going to spend that much time on. Public cloud versus private cloud, because I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on this. I actually want to focus more on the definition there of private cloud, that not just that it's single tenant, but the idea really is that it's designed to look cloudy, but I guess in agreement with the keynote earlier today, it isn't actually cloudy. Private cloud isn't really a cloud, and that seems a horrible thing for somebody who makes money off of selling software that helps people do private cloud components. And it sounds like that seems like an odd contrast, but it really isn't. A private cloud gives you an internally controlled environment that looks a little bit like a cloud, but it lacks a lot of key things that really make a cloud a cloud. And just the best example of that probably is the perception of infinite capacity. Private clouds are heavily capacity constrained, and that's why we talk a lot about things like cloud bursting to get around those capacity constraints. And don't confuse me saying that a private cloud is not a cloud with saying a private cloud is not a good thing. Private cloud has value in an overall strategy. The important thing is, as you develop an enterprise cloud strategy, you have to understand the limitations of private cloud and why it is only cloud-like and not truly a cloud, so that you can use it properly for the things that you need to be using a private cloud for, and you're using a public cloud for the things that properly need a public cloud environment. So you've got your strategy, you understand, how things are going to play from a bespoke versus a fully commoditized environment in your service models, and then you understand the value proposition of public cloud over the limitations and the value proposition of the private cloud. So then comes the problem, okay, I understand all this stuff, but how do I live with it? How do I actually execute on it? That starts with this idea of a cloud computing stack. And this, in and of itself, is an entire 1-hour talk without easily, because it encompasses not only the boxes on this screen here, but it also encompasses things like learning to design applications for failure. And thankfully you guys chose to be in here rather than the guy next door who's doing that talk. But just the design for failure bit is an entire talk next door. You have to appreciate that as part of adopting cloud computing. You have to appreciate how to integrate things like DevOps and configuration management. It doesn't mean you have to swallow all these things at once. You don't have to, day one, be an expert in NoSQL, continuous integration, DevOps, design for failure, and all that. That just isn't going to happen, and it's impossible to take that on at once. But you do need to realize that, that there are certain benefits from these tools, what those benefits are, where you are in terms of maturity as an organization today, and how and if you want to eventually internalize those things. Continuous integration, for example. If I told you all you had to move to continuous integration before you could do cloud, that would end the cloud discussion, because that's just, if you're not doing it today, that's a really hard problem in and of itself to solve. And the reality is you don't. You don't even have to think about continuous integration other than to realize it's a thing out there to be concerned with. From building a private cloud, these are sort of the boxes starting with the physical infrastructure. So if you're going to build a private cloud, you still need to worry about the physical infrastructure, but you also want to worry about how it's talking to the public cloud, which, in the mature cloud computing environment is going to be the default deployment model for most of your applications. So here's another fairly wordy slide. I'll try to keep it brief. The first thing is, problems are going to migrate from infrastructure to PaaS to SaaS, or may even skip from infrastructure over to SaaS over time. So you need to understand, when you're selecting the right deployment model, where are there solutions out there today that do what I'm trying to do? Don't try to reinvent the wheel if you don't have to. And then, do I have compliance concerns or other elements that mandate on-premise deployment versus being in a public cloud. Then, you know, so my general rule that I try to promote, and you know, a lot of traditional enterprise people get very nervous when I say this, is, you know, your default position when somebody comes to you with a problem should be try to find a SaaS solution in a public cloud for it. So SaaS, public first, private infrastructure is a last resort. And then you sort of have to prove your way down, you know, to the left and into the private cloud. So, you know, public cloud infrastructure before private cloud infrastructure. Private SaaS makes no sense, so I don't, you know, but there are, you know, with tools like Cloud Foundry, there's justification for doing private platform as a service as well. So one thing you see a lot of from enterprises who are used to, you know, things like Terramark or Savvis or whatever is that they look for this idea of an enterprise cloud. And you know, it's an idea that Terramark and Savvis try to push because they try to somehow paint Amazon as not being enterprise and they are enterprise, where generally what they mean by enterprise is not really cloud, because they implement a whole bunch of things that make it really look more like a vSphere deployment warmed over that you can access over the internet through a browser. What really makes a cloud enterprise has nothing to do with things like SLAs, and that's a very controversial thing to say to enterprise, is that essentially SLAs don't matter when it comes to cloud. What matters is the time to provision. You know, these enterprise, in my experience, the more a cloud talks about itself as being an enterprise cloud provider, the longer it takes to provision a VM. So I've seen, you know, enterprise clouds in which it takes an hour to provision a Windows VM. And the likelihood of success of provisioning the VM is relatively small. So you have to wait an hour to find out that, oops, it failed to provision the VM, and then you start the process over again. What really, really matters in the cloud, and what's critical to the idea of actually achieving real uptime in a cloud computing environment, is this provisioning time. And that's why Amazon is good at what they do. You can know that when you ask for a VM, you're going to get a VM, and it's going to come up pretty quickly, in most cases under 5 minutes. If you've got a Windows VM, maybe a little longer. But the bottom line is in a much more reasonable amount of time. And the thing is, what ends up happening is if you know you're going to get a VM, you can react to failure quicker than your recovery than what matters for your overall availability. And the net result is you can achieve greater uptime in the face of great failure, regardless of what the SLAs you're getting from the underlying cloud provider. And like I said, that's a topic in and of itself. So, you know, the value proposition for private cloud is not security. That is what people talk most about. It's security. Private cloud is more secure. Private cloud is neither more secure nor less secure. It can be more secure. It can be less secure. The reality of the scenario, as we saw, you know, in the keynote today, is that AWS is taking in security requirements and needs from a huge number of customers out there, and the chances are great that in the aggregate, they're going to operate their infrastructure more secure than you will. However, they're operating it in the aggregate, and for certain purpose-specific needs, there may be things that you can do that support whatever the purpose you're driving towards. but you still probably have to do a lot of the aggregate stuff as well, as the nature of information security is. But where the real value of private cloud is in transparency. And it really goes to the fact that, you know, I have more privileged access to the thoughts that are in my head than I have to the thoughts that are in your head. I only know what you're saying because of what you tell me. I can't validate what those thoughts are. That's the philosophy part of me coming out. But the same thing applies for operating an IT infrastructure. I know better what I'm doing with my infrastructure than I know what Amazon is doing with their infrastructure. No matter how much better they may be doing it or how much, you know, how well-intentioned they are, I just have privileged access to what I'm doing versus what they're doing. So there are certain compliance and regulatory situations where the transparency matters more than the reality matters. And that's where private cloud strengths comes into play. The important things to keep in mind, though, is that if you're building out a private cloud, the reason cloud sneaks in there as a word is that you're trying to create a cloud-like experience. And virtualization is not a cloud in any sense of any stretch of the imagination, and does not create a cloud-like experience for anybody. So if you just I don't know anybody who would just go give widespread access to their vCenter console, but if you did that, you haven't suddenly created yourself a cloud. You have a whole bunch of operating at scale issues and a hornet's nest of security issues that you suddenly have to deal with. To get to a private cloud, you need virtualization, plus you need a platform on top of it. And there's a whole competitive market out there of you know, cloud platforms like Eucalyptus, OpenStack, CloudStack, Nimbula, Joyent, a number of others. You need to have proper governance, and the governance starts with visibility into what's going on. I mentioned that 100+ accounts customer. What they first need to do in terms of getting IT involved in a meaningful way is IT has to know what those accounts are, why they exist, and what kind of data and processing is occurring in those. Those are legitimate IT needs, and IT having visibility in that has no impact whatsoever on what the business is doing. So your cloud strategy has to first start with this idea of visibility and getting an audit trail across all the clouds so that when something happens in those clouds, central IT who knows how to react to things that might be bad, that the business units don't have experience with, they can react to them. They catch an intrusion detection event from a VM operating in Amazon. It gets routed into Tivoli, and they get alerted on it. IT can react to that, whereas business units, if they have intrusion detection installed at all on their own, are probably ignoring the alerts because they got too noisy in the first place. Another legitimate aspect of governance is making sure that people can only access the things they're supposed to. If you shouldn't have access to provision VMs because you don't have any legitimate business need, which is different from having to go through a procurement process, but just the idea that you should be able to do that, you know, that's an important control. If you don't have access to a certain type of data, you should not be able to leverage or get access to that in the cloud. Those types of access controls are important points of governance. And then, you know, I alluded to integration with something like Tivoli. You need to have your cloud infrastructure interoperate with your traditional infrastructure in a way that IT is used to managing the infrastructure. You can't just say, drop everything you know, IT, you have to do things our way. But approvals processes kill clouds. And when I say this, I don't say this to mean that you absolutely can't implement any approval process in a cloud computing environment. You know, first of all, there are some regulated industries that you just can't provision a new resource without an approval, and so it has to happen. But those are the exceptions. Those are not the rule. In general, most, I'd say 90% of enterprises could get away with never implementing an approval in their cloud computing environment, or at least greatly minimizing it. But I tell you this, if you implement an approval process for provisioning a VM and the execution of the human execution of the approvals end up taking 3 weeks or 3 months, you have totally destroyed the value proposition of cloud. The next thing is, a lot of times people have this problematic existing application that they think, wouldn't it be good to just move it in the cloud so we didn't have to deal with it? And this tends to be, okay, you know, IT has bought into doing an enterprise cloud strategy, so they're trying to remove their headache and move it into the cloud so the business unit can worry about it. Tends to be the scenario. The problem is if something was a headache in your traditional infrastructure, it's going to be a headache in the cloud too. Probably a greater headache because it's probably designed to operate in the cloud. When you're, you know, undergoing the process of developing a cloud strategy, one of the things you will ultimately do is execute a proof of concept. There's no reason the proof of concept can't be a legacy application that is well suited to the problem domain of cloud computing, but the reality is that if you have the luxury, your greatest success will be to start with Greenfield and work back to well-suited legacy applications. I know that isn't always possible, but I guess the important point is avoid those applications that as your first one that are problematic to begin with, because like I said, they're going to be problematic in the cloud as well. I alluded to proof of concept. Once you have the strategy in place, you really do need to do a proof of concept. This is especially if it involves a private cloud component. And the best thing to do, to be honest, is deploy something into the public cloud, get comfortable with operating just at the application level in a cloud before you take on the task of building out a private cloud and figuring out all the stuff that comes with operating a private cloud. But whatever approach you take when it comes to doing the proof of concept, you should have a fixed checklist of mark criteria for success. Because what's going to end up happening every single time, I don't think I've ever seen this not happen, is that when people find out in an organization you're doing a cloud proof of concept, everybody's going to start hearing about it and want to get their 2 cents in. And over time, the proof of concept can balloon up, and then nobody's really sure what constitutes success anymore because, yeah, we succeeded on things this group wanted, but we didn't really get to the things the other group wanted, and we completely failed on things the other group wanted because our attention got divided or cloud wasn't well suited towards it or whatever. You got to stick at the start with a finite set of success criteria and avoid deviating that if at all possible, and then do a realistic assessment of success or failure, and how do you integrate that into further internalizing cloud. Finally, whatever the success factors are, the rogues should buy into it, because if you don't have buy-in from the rogues, they will continue to be rogues. So we're not taking questions here today, but you can, reach me on Twitter, send questions to me that way, send me an email. I'm happy to answer whatever questions you might have. Okay, thank you.